I'm starting the recording now. Good. Okay. Thank you all for both your prayer requests and also for some good activities. This is great. We've done a little bit of finger painting, Susan. Thank you for that idea. Okay. We're going to do a couple things tonight. Like I said at the beginning, we're combining a bunch of things. We're combining some fellowship. We're combining some Bible study. We're also combining some Zoom training along with that. So some of you have done some experience with using the chat. Some of you are getting some experience today. We're also going to be getting some experience with a feature called polls. So there will be a couple things that I'm going to be asking your opinion on later on in our conversation tonight, and you'll be able to vote yes or no. And it's I'm interested in seeing how it works. So I think it'll work okay. I've tried it once before. So as I'm learning, I'm grateful that you're willing to let me take you along for the ride. Let's start by asking, I want to ask folks, I'm going to mute everybody to start with, and I want to ask folks, was there anything from last week that when we were looking at Exodus 1 that you wanted to follow up with, or particularly struck you that you found yourself thinking about during the week? If you have something like that, and you were here last week, it can be either about the content, or it can be about some of the stuff that we watched. Some of the resources would work as well. If you have something like that, go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead and share, and start by saying your name. Sharon Shaw, I see that you've unmuted. Did you want to share something?
Yes. You know, the Wednesday morning Bible study is studying Exodus. We almost finished with the series, and one of the things is the conflict between the Pharaoh and God. And when I read this first chapter last week, you can tell that those battle lines are already being drawn, because the Pharaoh said, you know, I'm going to, you know, keep the Hebrews down. I'm going to kill their newborn baby boys. And yet God worked through people to make sure that those type of things did not happen.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah, the battle lines are already clear. As you remember from last week, and as you've read Exodus 1, the Pharaoh has decreed that all Hebrew baby boys are to be thrown into the Nile. And you have these two heroic midwives who make up an excuse. Oh, the Hebrew women, they labor very quickly. And by doing so, these two midwives are able to save many of the Hebrew boys. And there's already some conflict that's beginning to build between forces of evil represented by Pharaoh here, who's trying to oppress the Israelites, and the people of God. That's a really good observation. Thank you, Sharon. Anything else? Okay, seeing none. I'm going to go forward. I'm going to try and bring some sort of media to each of our meetings as we continue to meet on Wednesday nights. The one I'm bringing tonight is one of the resources that I shared with you last week. I have this resource page that I've been using, and I'm happy to share it with you all again for those of you who weren't here last week. This video is an 8-minute video. We're going to see about 5 minutes of it. It gives a quick overview of Exodus. It's not by the Bible Project, which are the people that did last week's video. This one is by a fellow with a website called Overview Bible. So I'm going to get that screen up that's sharing with y'all. So y'all may be able to see that screen now. And I'm going to make sure that you will be able to hear the sound as well. This website is a pretty good one. It has a survey of all 66 books of the Bible. In fact, it has like a 1-sentence summary of every single book, which is kind of neat. And then it also goes more in depth, sort of, 2 to 3 minute articles on, I think, almost every book. I don't know if they've got every book up here yet, but it's a really neat website, and it's on the resource page that I'll send out. I've also updated our Christian education resources on the Hope website with this page here. So you'll be able to access Overview Bible from that, and I'll also send it out after this as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is get this playing. I'm going to full screen it so you can see it a little bit better. And we're going to spend about 5 minutes listening to this guy give an overview of some of the beginning of the book of Exodus. Ready? Okay.
The book of Exodus. It's the second book of the Bible.
Can you hear that?
And one of the more important books to understand if you're going to understand the rest of the Bible. Now, it's a pretty long book, but its structure is pretty straightforward. And that's what we're going to look at today. But before we dive into the story and structure of Exodus, let's get a quick overview of some of the themes that we're going to see in Exodus. So Exodus shows us a lot about who God is. We're going to see his faithfulness, how God keeps his promises to his people. We're also going to learn about Israel's origins, and it's really their theological origins. Remember, in Genesis, we saw the ancestral origins of Israel, and we saw some of the promises that God made to the ancestors of the people of Israel. But now we're going to see Israel emerge as a nation. We're also going to see a little bit about God protecting his name and his reputation. He's a very powerful being in the Bible, the most powerful being, in fact. And so God really cares about how his people treat and respect him, and also how the gods of the other nations and how the other nations interact with him. So that's going to be an interesting thing for us to see in the book of Exodus. Then we also have the law. Now, the first 5 books of the Bible are collectively called the law, or the law of Moses. And Exodus gives us the introduction of how Israel came to have a law that came from God. Now, beyond those themes, we also have a core tension that we're going to see not only in the book of Exodus, but also in the rest of the Old Testament. And that tension is between God, the people of Israel, and then the other nations and their gods. Throughout the rest of the Old Testament, we're going to see God calling the people of Israel to be loyal to him and to obey him and to reflect his goodness to the rest of the world. But we're also going to see Israel being drawn to mimic the other nations and worship their gods in ways that run contrary to what God's expectations are for his people. And then, of course, that creates conflict between the Israelites' God and the gods of the other nations. That's the divine love triangle of the Old Testament, if you will. Now, as far as the book of Exodus goes, although it's a very long book, its structure is really straightforward. Exodus is 40 chapters long, and the first half deals with God rescuing the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. And then the second half deals with how God forms a new relationship with the people of Israel in the wilderness. It's pretty easy to remember because the rescue story goes from chapters 1 to 19, and then the relationship story is chapters 20 to 40. So if you just remember the second half starts at 20 and runs to 40, then you have a pretty good idea of the general arc of Exodus. And then once you get into that second half, there is some interesting parallelism happening there, which we'll get into in just a moment. Let's start with the first half. Now, the first half opens with this prologue. If you remember in Genesis, the people of Israel, which was a small family group, moved down to Egypt during a famine because one of Jacob's, or Israel's, sons was a leader in Egypt who had found a way to store food and save a lot of lives because of it. So Israel moves down to Egypt and they are honored guests. But a couple generations later, the Pharaoh of Egypt says, I don't remember Joseph, I don't know what these Israelites are doing here, but there sure are a lot of them, so let's enslave them and then kill all their baby boys so that they can't rise up against us. Not a nice guy. But there's one baby that escapes this genocide, and that's Moses. You've probably heard the story of how Moses' mother put him in a basket and set him adrift in the river, and then he was found by Pharaoh's daughter. Well, that plays out in the 2nd chapter of Exodus. So Moses escapes this genocide, and then he grows up and he sees some of the Israelites being mistreated. So he tries to save the Israelites on his own. It doesn't go so well, and Moses is exiled in that 2nd chapter. But that's really just the opening to the story.
That's all we need for today, is just the opening of the story. Sorry for the abrupt cutoff, but we're going to be reading some of all of Exodus chapter 2, which contains the last chunk of what he was talking about there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to recommend that if you have a Bible, go ahead and grab it now. Pull it out. I've got mine on my stand here. And we're going to read through the 2nd chapter of Exodus. And we're going to have a couple folks take turns. If folks need to get up and grab their Bibles, that's just fine. I think last week I shared my screen and I put up a Bible Gateway, which is an excellent internet Bible that you can find. You can pull up just about any translation. But when I pull up and share the screen, that's kind of all anybody's able to see, and you're not able to see, anyone who's talking or asking questions. So I'm going to try and make sure that each person has a Bible in front of them that they can use this time. So we're going to be going through the entire chapter of Exodus 2, and there are like 3 main chunks there. There's the chunk that goes from verse 1 through verse 10, which I'm going to have a volunteer read. There's a chunk that goes from verse 11 to verse 15, and there's a final chunk that goes from verse 16 to verse 25. So 1 to 10, 11 through 15, and then 16 through 25. Would somebody be willing to read verses 1 through 10? I see Reeves' hand up, and then I saw Bob's hand right after. Bob, would you be willing to read 11 through 15? Great, thank you, Bob. And if you notice, those of you who could see Bob, what he did was he did a very exaggerated nod. That's helpful. If you can exaggerate some of your nonverbals so I can see that, that helps me a lot. Thank you for doing that, Bob. The last chunk is 16 through 25. Would somebody be willing to read that? Judy, oh, sorry, Sarah raised her hand. Judy, I think you were just nodding. I don't know if you were volunteering, but I saw Sarah Evans' hand go up. Okay, well, go ahead, Reeve, and kick us off. Let us know what translation you're using, and then go for it.
I'm using the NIV. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sisters stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. And the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water."
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Reeve. Well done. Appreciate that reading. Go ahead, Bob. Take 11 through 15.
This is NIV also. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you the ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When the Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well.
Thank you, Bob. Well done. Sarah, the passage that you're going to read is really like two chunks. It's one big chunk and one little chunk at the end, but I didn't want to divvy them up. But as you're reading, those last three verses are sort of a summary of the entire prologue. So I wanted to make sure everybody knew that. Verses 16 through 25, Sarah, and what translation are you reading from?
And I have the NIV today, just like everybody else. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "And where is he?" Reuel asked his daughters. "Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." And these are the 3 verses that Joel said were kind of a synopsis. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them.
Thank you, Sarah. You had some fun names there, and you crushed it. Well done. I should give a disclaimer when I know that a section has challenging names. Sorry for not doing that.
Well, at least none of these were like 8 syllables long like some of the other ones.
So the first question that I have for y'all that I would just love for a couple people to speak to is we normally tell this story to children as young as first and second grade. What do you think of that? How appropriate, in other words, is this story to be sharing with elementary schoolers? Is that something that you've thought about or that concerns you? Ashlyn, I see your hand. Go ahead.
I would say that's questionable, sir.
Questionable. Okay, Penny, I see your hand being raised. I see Barbara's hand as well. Go ahead, Penny. Penny, I think you're muted. I'm going to unmute you. There you go. You are unmuted now.
I can say as a former teacher of 2, 3, and 4 years old and grandmothers of the same, that we teach it at that age too. We're very gentle about it. We don't stress the dying. We stress the rescue and the cleverness of the mommy and the cleverness of the sister.
Good.
What you
Thank
stress
you.
matters.
Right. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Penny. I see Emily, but Barb was next. Go ahead, Barbara. There you go.
I look back on my growing up years, even being young, and it never, it didn't hurt me. In fact, I think it made me remember that story more than if I would have just read it. I don't think it hurts. It's like Penny said, if you do it correctly. But I remember it as a child, and it was great to me that somebody found that little boy.
Thank you. Emily, go ahead and chime in there.
Well, I too think it told to children in the right way, it teaches them about what saving means. I mean, Exodus is a story of redemption for the Jewish people. We have the story of Jesus for redemption. So it starts to build the concept of saving, and also the kindness of someone who's not your race to someone, the kindness of the Pharaoh's daughter to reach out. So that's what I think. I think it's okay. I've been in Penny's Sunday school class many times, and she teaches it so well.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. The framing does matter. What you emphasize absolutely does matter. I think too that you hit on something that I've got a note on, and that's Pharaoh's daughter here. And Pharaoh's daughter seemingly unconcerned about Pharaoh's decree to throw these Hebrew babies into the river. This is, you could perhaps think of it as a form of civil disobedience coming from the throne itself, from the palace itself. Of all the people to implicitly rebel against Pharaoh's command, Pharaoh's daughter is an interesting one. What sort of thoughts do you have on this, that it's Pharaoh's daughter that adopts Moses as her own?
To me, it seems.
Oh, good, Sarah.
Yeah, to me it seems like this is the difference between the older generation and the younger generation, and how did she explain this to Dad? Maybe they weren't even close enough. I mean, in their society, I don't know if she would have even seen her father on a regular basis. But my thought is, okay, how do we explain this to Dad? Right.
Arthur, I see you or Linda have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, the way it's just to say that not all Egyptians were of the same thought. There was, just different people had different thoughts, and including his own family. Is not the whole country. It's not everyone. So it kind of teaches people that, not everybody.
Right. You can't judge a people group monolithically like that. I see Sarah Hamsa had unmuted herself, and then Bunny had unmuted herself. And then I've got one more question that I want to ask y'all with a poll. Oh, and I see Diane waving her hand as well. So we'll go Sarah Hamsa, Bunny, then Diane.
I thought it was very interesting that she actually paid wages to the mother to nurse. That was a very interesting, I guess I had forgotten that, but not only like Sarah Evans, how did she explain it to her father, but then by stroke of whatever, the child gets his mother to nurse him. And I thought, that definitely was God's hand placing that mother back with her baby.
Yes, and being paid to break the law and not throw your baby. It's incredible. Yes, thank you for bringing that up, Sarah. Bunny.
I was wondering if she had any other children, if she had tried and failed to have children, and it's only one. You consider how many baby boys were probably thrown into the Nile, it's one. So maybe that's how she got away with it so easily.
Right. It may be that the Pharaoh didn't see that it was, worth making a big fuss out of it. Maybe, is that what you're saying, Bunny? That if it's just one, then no harm can come. I see you nodding. Okay, great, thank you. Diane, go ahead and chime in. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Okay. I was thinking that perhaps she's just very against her dad's order to kill all the babies, and that was kind of her little rebellion against him. And I'm not sure, but I'm assuming the Pharaoh probably had many wives and therefore many children. And, you know, she well might have not been very close to her dad or even seen him very often. Maybe he wasn't a big part of her life. Mm-hmm. And again, you know, we don't know her story if she had wanted a child and couldn't have one.
Sure, right. Go ahead, Penny, and then this will be the last thing that we'll say on this.
Just really fast, I think it's really cool that several women, 2 midwives, a princess and a mom, got rid of Pharaoh's edict. They overpowered Pharaoh.
Yeah, thank you. That was something that I was going to bring up as well, so I'm grateful you did. That's perfect. That the mighty Pharaoh here is being opposed, by 2 midwives, by a Hebrew woman, and by his daughter. Like it's amazing, particularly when you think culturally at this point. You know, women were property, second-class citizens, in maybe in a kind way, right? Like if you're interpreting the law kindly, they're second-class citizens. Yeah, it's a big deal. I want to get your thoughts, and this is where I'm gonna try and use a poll here. So you may see something pop up on your screen. I want to get your thoughts on some of the violence that happens in this chapter. So we've got Moses' violence against the shepherds at the well to defend Zipporah, his future wife, and the other the other daughters of Reuel. You have Moses' violence against the Egyptian taskmaster. And I want to know what you think about violence generally. Is violence justifiable for Christians? So I'm going to put this poll up, and I'm going to ask you to click yes or no. And I can't give the poll multiple times to the same screen. So those of you who are sharing a screen with a spouse or loved one, you're going to have to come to an agreement. Good luck. Ready, set, go. And it should have popped up on your screen. We're going to take about a minute to go through this poll, and you can vote yes or no for each of these questions. Okay, we got about 10 more seconds, and if you need more time, start waving your hands frantically. Okay, 3, 2, 1, and I'm going to end the polling, and I will share the results with all of you here. And we're ending. You know, it would be a darn bit easier if I gave that depends answers on some of these, but I do want to share some of the results with you. So you should be able to see these now. Interesting. It's interesting the division here. So we've got is Moses' violence against the shepherds at the well justified? And 17 of you said yes. 4 of you said no. Is Moses' violence against the Egyptian taskmaster justified? It's a little bit closer. It's a 12-9 spread. And then are Christians justified in using violence for the sake of righteousness? We've got 11 yes and 10 no, the closest of all of these. That's interesting. I'd love to hear a couple of you share from these. I'd love one representative from the yes question, or the yes answer to question 1, if you feel comfortable outing yourself, I guess. Is Moses' violence against the shepherds at the well justified? If you said yes and you'd like to say something about that, go ahead and wave your hand around a little bit. Emily, I saw you first. Go ahead.
Well, I said yes because I felt that he was defending the innocent.
Excellent, thank you.
Accept that because he was defending the innocent.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you. I see Emily Clark. You're looking to say something, but I'm going to try to do one from each of these because I want to be cognizant of our time. I'm looking for somebody, if you said no to the first question and are willing to speak to that, and say a little bit why you thought that, I would love for you to volunteer. Go ahead and just kind of wave your hand around. I am seeing crickets right now. Well, that's okay. Those of you who said no to the first question, you'll remain nameless. I shan't share your identity with anybody. The second question is Moses' violence against the Egyptian taskmaster justified? If you answered yes to that and you'd like to speak to that, go ahead and wave your hand a little bit so I can see you. Okay, Emily Clark, go ahead.
He is helping the downtrodden, his people, in essence. That's why I get that gut reaction.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. I think it's neat that both folks who said yes to justifying this violence said yes on account of those he was helping, defending the innocent or the defenseless, defending the downtrodden. Thank you. Emily, did you want to add one more thing to that? Okay,
nope.
Great. What about somebody who said no to Moses' violence against the Egyptian taskmaster being justified? Would somebody like to speak to that? Go ahead, Sharon. I saw your hand. And I'm going to call on two people this time because I didn't call on anybody for the first no, and I saw Sarah Evans' hand before yours, Dave. I'm sorry. So Sharon and then Sarah. Go ahead, Sharon.
It's not that, it was wrong for the Egyptian to beat the Hebrew, but my sense was that he did not control his temper, and he went ahead and did this because in verse 12, it says, glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So maybe he was aware that what he was doing was not good, was not right.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sharon. Actually, Sarah, since you already read some scripture today, would you mind if I heard from Dave?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dave, and share what you were going to share. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Here.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It goes from something I had read more than how I feel, but it seems like he was acting as God himself. He was doing God's job. It wasn't his job. It was God's.
Thank you,
I don't
Dave.
know if that makes sense or not, but he's stepping in for God, and God really hasn't instructed him to do this. He does it on his own.
Sure. He's taking on the role of judge here instead of allowing God to be the final judge. Thank you. I appreciate that take. Great. For question number 3, one of what I asked y'all is, are Christians justified in using violence for the sake of righteousness? And that was the closest one. It was 11 yeses and 10 nos. Would somebody who hasn't spoken yet, who said yes, be willing to speak more to that? I saw Mary Kinsler's hand come up. I also saw Ron Boland's hand come up. This is where the rubber meets the road, so I'll take 2 yeses and 2 nos. Go ahead, Mary first, and then I saw Ron Boland. And Gloria Munguia, you unmuted as well, but I can't see your video. So I'm sorry if you've been waving frantically.
No, I have not.
I saw Mary first, and then I saw Ron. So go ahead, Mary.
Well, I think instead of the plural of Christians, it becomes individual. Because unless the Christians all got together and discussed what their thoughts were, so let's just take it as one person. And I think one is so convicted in their belief and in their interpretation of what God is expecting of their actions during a certain situation, that becomes their basis of violence.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Ron, did you want to chime into that as well?
Well, I'm not sure I'm wise enough to understand when violence is appropriate and when it's not. However, the Bible is replete with violent activity throughout it, especially in the Old Testament. But it occurs to me that you could probably make a point that Jesus used violence in the temple when he ran out the money changers. I don't know that violence in itself is bad if you've got a greater good. And certainly God has used violence throughout the Bible. I think the storm that wipes out all humanity except for Noah is probably a pretty just use of violence. So the Lord himself used a form of violence in the temple, and I don't know whether that makes it right or wrong, but certainly that's a case to be made there, I think.
Thank you, Ron. I appreciate that. Those of you who spoke on the other side of that, who said no to are Christians justified in using violence, Kurt, I saw your hand, and Bunny, I saw your hand as well. Kurt, you can go ahead and speak first, and then Bunny, since you already spoke, I'm going to see if anybody else wants to go, and if not, then I'm more than happy to hear from you as well. Kurt, go ahead first, and then we'll get the next person.
Yeah, my screen only had one question.
Oh. I'm sorry about that.
I wanted to say that I think this is a question we all struggle with all the time about violence. So I think I read that in the book as a real human question that it's hard to answer. There are times when I think, yes, it's right, and other times when I think it's wrong, you know? So I don't know, it just depends on the day, or it depends on the issue that I would say yes or no.
Thank you, Kurt.
Joel, this is Gloria Munguia.
Hey, Gloria.
I voted no on all of them because I just don't think that violence is the way to go. It's almost like, well, a quick way to solve things. I mean, one of the commandments is thou shalt not kill. And I'm thinking in history, you know, the Spaniards came to this land, to this hemisphere, and killed and tortured the Indians to get them to believe in God. So they were killing in the name of God. And to me, that's just not right. So I just don't believe in violence.
Thank you, Gloria. I appreciate that. This is something where I'm trying to keep an eye on the time. It's past 8:30, and I'm trying to keep a pretty hard stop at 8:30. We're going to crawl a little bit over, but we're going to get out of here in just a minute. This is a very difficult question, and a question that Christians for centuries, if not millennia, have been wrestling with. That's why you have different sects of Christianity that are pacifistic in nature, and other sects of Christianity that are not. And so there's not a clean answer, which is one of the reasons why it's such an interesting question. For some, any means of promoting righteousness is valid. And that's what I heard a couple of you saying, where, you know, if you are convinced of the rightness of this, then you need to defend it at all costs. And still others, I've heard violence compared to the One Ring in The Lord of the Rings, where, you know, darn it, you would want to use it for good, but it ends up corrupting your spirit and corrupting your soul. And so sometimes Christians fall on that side of this question. So it's not a simple question. And so I appreciate y'all wrestling with it a little bit. We'll have plenty of questions to wrestle with like that throughout our time in Exodus. A couple other things I wanted to have you note in the reading today before we end with a word of prayer and go about our evenings. I wanted to note that Moses goes and seeks refuge among the Midianites. Midian was one of the sons of Abraham, actually, with his second wife, Keturah. You can read about that if you'd like in Genesis 25. So these are like distant relatives of Moses that he went to seek refuge with. And there's also this idea of Moses' identity as a stranger that is going to come up, and it's going to be very formative to him. A couple of y'all in this group were part of our Seekers conversation earlier tonight. when we were talking about statements of faith and how your story, your faith story, plays a huge role in your faith statement and what you believe. This idea of Moses' identity as a stranger is going to play a huge role in how he sees himself, both as a Hebrew who was raised among Egyptians, and also as an Egyptian who fled Egypt to get away from his family, the Pharaoh's family, to seek refuge among the people of Midian. Moses doesn't really have a home. He's a Hebrew raised by Egyptians who found his people among the Midianites. And as such, he's a unique individual that's going to have a unique perspective on God and on taking leadership of these people when he eventually leads them out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. So keep that in your back pocket as we go on through Exodus. I'm going to invite, if any one person has a final thought and can unmute themselves and share it, the first person to unmute themselves to give a final thought is going to be the one who can give it. And then I'm going to ask if somebody would be willing to pray us out.
I have a closing thought.
Great. Would you also, Sarah, be willing to pray us out if you don't mind me volunteering you? You're the best. Thank you.
Is violence ever justified? That's a question I think we probably all have to ask. Is there a place and a time for violence of anybody at any time? And that's not a question we can answer today, tomorrow, or right away. But anyway, I will be more than happy to pray us out.
Thank you, sir.
Dear Heavenly Father, be with all of us as we wrestle with Exodus and Moses. Be with all of us as we go about our day. Help us to have a plan for our day. It helps things work better. We ask your divine guidance. Please help them find a vaccine. Please help the scientists that are working, help them find some way to relieve these people that have this horrible, horrible, horrible virus. All of us are asking this over and over again. We ask for peace for ourselves. We ask for love. We ask for our hearts to be filled with your peace and your love from this day forward. As we get ready for Easter Sunday, help us know the reason for the season. In your Father, in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all of you for being here this evening. God bless you. Enjoy your Holy Week. I'm going to unmute all of you so you can all say goodbye if you'd like.
Okay, good night.
Bye. Bye.